When I tell people about this, they usually think I'm either crazy or making it up. But it happened, and I can't stop thinking about it. It was 2 years ago, in late October, when the days were crisp and the nights were sharp enough to cut your skin. I live in a small town, the kind of place where the biggest attraction is the local park. It's old, with dense trees that stretch their limbs like they're trying to hold up the sky. There's a pond in the middle with a wooden bench overlooking it, my favorite spot to read after work. That bench always felt peaceful, like a refuge from everything, until it didn't. It was a Thursday. I remember because I had stayed late at work and almost skipped my usual walk. But something about the crisp autumn air called to me, so I grabbed my coat and headed to the park. By the time I got there, the sun was a burnt orange smear, slipping behind the trees. The park was unusually quiet, with only the rustle of leaves and the occasional caw of a crow breaking the silence. I made my way to the bench, pulled out my book, and started reading. It was a murder mystery, something to distract me from the monotony of the week. I was maybe 10 pages in when I heard it. A whisper. "Help me." I froze. It was faint, almost drowned out by the breeze, but I was sure I heard it. I looked around. The park was empty. Just me and the shadows creeping in as the sun disappeared. "Help me." This time, it was clearer, closer. My heart started to race. It was coming from the big oak tree a few feet away. Its trunk was massive, gnarled with age, and its roots spread out like fingers clawing at the earth. I told myself it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, more insistent. "Please help me." I stood up, my book slipping from my hands. The voice, it sounded young, almost childlike. I should have left right then and there, but something pulled me toward the tree. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. As I approached, the air grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I reached out to touch the bark, and that's when I saw it. A hand, small, pale, and impossibly thin, sticking out from the roots. My stomach twisted. It looked human but wrong, like something that hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Help me!" The voice begged again, weak and trembling. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was it a prank? A hidden speaker? But no. The hand moved, fingers curling like it was trying to grab me. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to listen. Instead, I dropped to my knees and started digging. The dirt was damp and cold, clinging to my fingers as I clawed at it. I couldn't stop myself. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. "You're almost there. Please hurry." The hand twitched again, and for a split second, I thought I saw the bark of the tree shift, like it was watching me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heartbeat pounded in my ears, but I kept digging. The soil seemed endless, no matter how much I pulled away. And then, suddenly, I hit something solid. It wasn't a root. It was smoother, harder, bone-like. My stomach churned, but I kept going, brushing away the dirt to reveal what lay beneath. It was a face, or at least it looked like one. Pale, hollow-eyed, and sunken. The skin stretched tight over jagged features. It didn't look alive, but its mouth moved. "Thank you," it whispered. Its voice barely audible now. I scrambled back, falling onto my hands. The thing stared at me, its hollow eyes brimming with something that might have been relief or hunger. Before I could react, the ground beneath the tree trembled. Roots slithered out like snakes, curling around the figure, pulling it deeper into the earth. "No, wait," I shouted, though I didn't know why. The whispers stopped. The air was still, too still. I realized then how quiet the park had become. No rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, nothing. Just silence, thick and suffocating. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling. The tree stood there, motionless and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. The hand was gone. The roots were back in place, neatly tucked into the earth. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I looked at my hands, they were covered in dirt and something else. a dark, sticky residue that smelled faintly of rot. I grabbed my book and ran, leaving the park behind. The whole way home, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the tree following me, its branches stretching out to pull me back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, and always the same words, "Help me." The next day, I went back to the park, even though every instinct told me not to. I had to know if it was real. The bench was there. The tree was there. But the ground around it was untouched, as if no one had ever dug there. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the tree, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I stopped going to the park after that. The whispers followed me, though. At night, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I still hear them. Sometimes they're faint, barely a breath. Other times, they're loud enough to make me cover my ears. Last week, I found something under my bed, a clump of dirt and a small, withered root. I don't know how it got there, but I'm starting to think the tree isn't done with me yet. This happened about a year ago, and I still can't explain it. I was visiting my hometown for the holidays, staying with my parents. It's a quiet little place with not much to do, but there's a park near their house that I always liked. It's small but charming, with winding trails and a pond that reflects the sky like a mirror. When I was younger, I'd spend hours there, just walking or sitting by the water. It was late December, and the weather was cold but clear. I needed some air, so I decided to take a walk to the park. It was around 4 p.m. when I got there, and the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I followed the familiar path to the pond, hands stuffed in my coat pockets, my breath puffing out in white clouds. The park was nearly empty, just how I liked it. There was a couple walking a dog on the other side of the pond, but otherwise, it was quiet, peaceful. And then I saw him. He was sitting on one of the benches by the pond, hunched over, staring at the water. His clothes looked odd, old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photo. A long coat, a scarf, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I couldn't make out his features, but something about him made me uneasy. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice me at all. He just sat there, completely still. I walked past him, keeping my distance, and found another bench a little further down. I sat there, pulling out my phone to scroll aimlessly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I glanced up a couple of times, but he hadn't moved, not an inch. After about 10 minutes, I decided to leave. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows were stretching long across the ground. As I stood up, I looked back at the bench where the man had been sitting. He was gone. I froze. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. The path was empty, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind in the trees. The couple with the dog had disappeared too, leaving the park eerily silent. That's when I heard it. A soft splash, like something or someone had entered the water. I turned toward the pond. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't right. There was movement, ripples spreading out from the center, like something was lurking just beneath. And then I saw him again, standing on the other side of the pond, his figure dark and indistinct. He wasn't hunched anymore. He stood tall, his hat tilted just enough that I thought I could see the faint glint of eyes beneath it. He was watching me. My heart was pounding. I blinked, hoping he would disappear, but he didn't. He just stood there, motionless, his outline blurred by the dim light and the growing mist that clung to the pond's surface. I took a step back, then another. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't look away from him. His presence felt oppressive, like the air had grown heavier just by him being there. And then, without warning, he moved. It wasn't a normal movement, like walking or even running. One second he was on the other side of the pond, and the next, he was closer. not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could see him more clearly. His face, or what should have been his face, wasn't right. It was pale, too pale, like wax, with no discernible features except for two black, empty sockets where his eyes should have been. I stumbled back, nearly falling, but I didn't take my eyes off him. The world seemed to tilt around me, the edges of my vision darkening. The only thing that felt real was him, standing there, watching me with those hollow sockets. He raised a hand then, slow and deliberate, pointing toward the pond. His fingers were unnaturally long, the skin stretched tight over the bones. I shook my head, trying to understand, trying to convince myself this wasn't happening. "Leave," a voice whispered. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was everywhere, seeping into my ears, my mind. "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the damp path. The sound of my breath was deafening, my pulse hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, the trees around me blurring into a dark tunnel. When I finally reached the entrance of the park, I stopped, gasping for air. The streetlights flickered above me, and the distant hum of traffic was the most comforting sound I'd ever heard. I glanced back toward the pond, but the park was dark and empty. There was no sign of him. I went straight home and locked every door and window. My parents noticed how shaken I was, but I didn't tell them what happened. What could I even say? That I saw a man with no eyes who seemed to bend the laws of reality? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing there, pointing, his hollow gaze drilling into me. And worse, I kept hearing the splash, over and over, like something pulling itself out of the water. The next morning, I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But when I went to check my coat, I found it soaked at the hem, muddy and cold. I hadn't gone near the pond. I haven't been back to that park since, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faintest sound of water dripping, and in my dreams, he's still there, pointing at the pond, waiting for me to come back. This happened last summer when I was on a road trip with my girlfriend Lisa. We'd been driving all day and decided to stop for the night in a small town. It was one of those places that barely registers on a map, with a single diner, a gas station, and not much else. We found a cheap motel, dropped off our stuff, and went out for a walk to stretch our legs. There was a park nearby, according to the motel clerk. Cooper's Hollow, he'd called it. It sounded quaint, so we decided to check it out. The sun was just setting when we got there, the sky streaked with shades of gold and violet. The park itself was small, with a gravel path that wound through clusters of trees and an open field dotted with picnic tables. It felt peaceful, the kind of place you'd bring kids for a Sunday afternoon picnic, but there was something strange about it too. I can't quite explain it, but the air felt heavier the moment we stepped into the park. Not oppressive, exactly, just charged, like before a thunderstorm. We wandered down the path, enjoying the cool evening air. Lisa was snapping pictures on her phone, trying to catch the way the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. As we walked, we noticed something odd. The park had no lights, no lampposts, no hanging bulbs, nothing. The further we went, the darker it got. Lisa joked about it, calling it budget cuts. But I was starting to feel uneasy. The darkness felt too deep, too sudden. I suggested we turn back, but she wanted to keep going. "Just a little further," she said, tugging on my arm. That's when we saw him. He was standing in the middle of the path, holding a lantern. It was an old, weathered thing, the kind you'd see in period dramas or antique shops. The flame inside flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on his face. He looked old, ancient, almost, with deep wrinkles and sunken eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. His clothes were tattered and gray, blending into the darkness. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly and low. Lisa hesitated, clearly caught off guard, but she smiled politely. "Hi." We were just out for a walk. The man nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between us. Not many come here after dark, he said. There was something off about his tone. Flat, like he was stating a fact rather than making conversation. You should leave soon. Lisa glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. She thought he was just some eccentric local, but my stomach was knotting up. There was something about the way he stood, the way his lantern barely illuminated him, that made my skin crawl. We were just heading back, I said quickly, grabbing Lisa's hand. The man didn't move, didn't say another word. He just watched as we turned around and walked back the way we came. But after a few steps, I realized the darkness behind us wasn't receding. It was growing thicker, swallowing the path like ink spilling across paper. The shadows crept closer with every step we took. I glanced back, hoping to see the faint glow of the lantern, but it was gone. The man wasn't there anymore. Or if he was, the darkness had swallowed him too. Let's go, I whispered to Lisa, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She must have heard it anyway because she squeezed my hand tightly and quickened her pace. The path seemed endless. I was sure we hadn't walked this far before. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out what little light remained. And the air, it felt colder now, heavier. The sound of gravel crunching under our feet was the only thing keeping me grounded. Then, the lantern appeared again. It was ahead of us this time, swaying gently in the distance. The man was standing by the edge of the path, his face hidden in shadow. The weak flame cast just enough light to show the outline of his figure. How did he get there? Lisa stammered, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't walking. He wasn't running. He was just there, impossibly ahead of us. Turn back, the man said. His voice echoed strangely, like it wasn't coming from his mouth but from the trees, the ground, everywhere at once. It's not safe. This time, I didn't argue. I yanked Lisa's arm and turned around, dragging her with me. We ran, the darkness closing in around us. The path twisted and turned, and I started to panic, convinced we were going in circles. And then I saw the lantern again. Behind us, it bobbed along, getting closer, the flame flickering wildly. The man's silhouette loomed larger and larger, but he didn't seem to be walking. He just floated toward us, the lantern's glow illuminating nothing but his pale, wrinkled face and those sunken, gleaming eyes. Run, I shouted. We sprinted blindly through the trees, the gravel giving way to uneven dirt. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our skin, but we didn't stop. The lantern's glow flickered in and out behind us, like it was chasing us. Finally, we burst out of the trees and into the open field near the park entrance. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. I didn't look back as we ran to the car. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and sped off, not daring to stop until we were miles away. We didn't talk about it that night. Neither of us wanted to admit what we'd seen, or what we thought we'd seen. The next morning, I decided to look up Cooper's Hollow, hoping to find some logical explanation. What I found still chills me. Years ago, the park had been a mining site. According to old reports, there was a cave-in during a night shift, trapping several workers underground. The rescue team couldn't reach them in time, and they all died. Locals say that one of the miners had been carrying a lantern, searching for an escape when the collapse happened. He's been seen in the park ever since, warning people not to stay after dark. I don't know if it was him we saw. I don't even know if I believe in ghosts. But Lisa and I haven't spoken about that night since. We haven't been back to Cooper's Hollow, either. Sometimes, though, when I close my eyes, I see the flicker of a lantern. And every time, I feel that same weight in the air, heavy and cold. It was supposed to be a quick run. I live near a sprawling park with miles of trails, and it's my go-to place for clearing my head after work. That evening, the air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your skin sticky. A light fog had rolled in, unusual for late spring, but not enough to deter me. I needed the run. I strapped on my sneakers, put in my earbuds, and headed out just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The park wasn't crowded, only a couple of people walking dogs and a lone cyclist heading back toward the parking lot. I chose a trail that wound deeper into the park, where the trees formed a dense canopy and the fog clung to the ground like smoke. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. The fog had grown thicker, obscuring the trail ahead. The trees, normally so familiar, seemed distorted, their trunks stretching unnaturally tall in the dim light. My music suddenly felt out of place, too loud, too intrusive. I pulled out my earbuds, letting the silence of the park settle over me. That's when I heard it. A giggle. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves, but unmistakable. A child's giggle, high-pitched and light, echoing through the fog. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The trail was empty. I hadn't seen anyone since I started running, let alone a child. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response, just the quiet hiss of the wind and the faint, distant hum of traffic from the city. I told myself it was probably nothing, a trick of the wind or my imagination playing games. But as I turned to keep running, I saw movement in the fog. A small figure darted across the trail up ahead, just at the edge of my vision. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it looked like a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looked like a white dress. My stomach tightened. What would a kid be doing out here alone, this late? "Hey!" I called again, jogging forward. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it vanished into the trees, leaving behind only the swirling fog. I hesitated, torn between going after it and turning back. If it really was a kid, they could be lost or in trouble. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. The air was colder now, sharper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Hello?" I called one more time, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The giggle came again, louder this time, closer, and then a voice, soft, sing-song, and far too calm. "Come play with me." My blood turned cold. The voice was unmistakably a child's, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. It was too steady, too calm, and far too close. I spun around, searching the fog for any sign of the kid, but the trail was empty. "Where are you?" I called, my voice cracking. No response, just the fog, thick and clinging, wrapping around me like a damp blanket. I could barely see a few feet ahead now, and the trail seemed unfamiliar, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at the gray mist. "Come play with me," the voice repeated, this time from behind me. I whipped around so fast I nearly lost my balance. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was the child. She was pale, almost translucent, with dark hair that hung limp over her face. Her white dress was tattered and stained with something dark, mud, maybe, or something else. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, staring at me. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't move closer. Something deep inside me screamed to keep my distance. She tilted her head, as if considering my question, then giggled again. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the trees in a way that didn't make sense. "Come play with me," she said once more, but her mouth didn't move. I took a step back. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in place. The fog seemed to thicken around her, swirling and churning, as if alive. What do you want?" I stammered. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. Another giggle, this one deeper, harsher, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, she vanished. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. swallowed by the fog. The silence was deafening. I stood frozen, my breath coming in ragged gasps, waiting for her to reappear. But the trail was empty. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away. The fog seemed to follow me, clinging to my skin, seeping into my lungs. The trees blurred together, their shapes twisting and warping in the dim light. I could still hear her giggle, faint and distant, but no matter how fast I ran, it stayed with me. Finally, I burst out of the fog and into the parking lot. The air was clearer here, lighter, but I didn't stop running until I was in my car with the doors locked. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the entrance to the trail, half expecting her to appear again. She didn't, but as I started the car and drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I saw her standing at the edge of the lot, her dark eyes watching me. And then she was gone. I haven't been back to that park since. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the fog and the fading light. But some nights, when the air is heavy and the world feels too quiet, I hear her voice again. Come play with me. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. My friends and I had planned a small get-together at Oakwood Park, a sprawling place with picnic areas, playgrounds, and a central pavilion that overlooked the lake. We'd gone there a dozen times before, mostly for late-night chats around the fire pit or just to hang out when no one wanted to be stuck indoors. That night, it was just me, Danny, and Chris. The others had bailed last minute, so it was quieter than usual. We arrived around 9 p.m., lugging a cooler of drinks and snacks, and set up at one of the tables in the pavilion. The air was cool, the stars were out, and the lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight. It was perfect. About an hour in, Danny decided to tell ghost stories. She always loved that kind of thing, though Chris and I usually just rolled our eyes. But that night, the park felt different. There was a stillness to it, a silence that settled over the place like a blanket. Even the crickets seemed quieter than usual. So when Danny started talking about urban legends, we didn't interrupt. It felt fitting. Her story was about a man who'd supposedly drowned in the lake decades ago. According to her, he was a park ranger who'd gone out to investigate a disturbance one night and never returned. His body was found floating near the pavilion the next morning, but no one could explain what had happened. People started claiming they'd seen his shadow walking along the shoreline or standing under the pavilion, watching them. Chris laughed it off, as expected, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I tried to brush it off as just the atmosphere. Fog was starting to roll in off the lake, and the shadows cast by the moonlight made everything look strange. We decided to call it a night around 11. The fog had thickened, and the pavilion felt colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your skin no matter how many layers you're wearing. As we were packing up, I noticed something. A shadow. It wasn't ours. It stood at the far end of the pavilion, near the railing that overlooked the lake. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move, didn't waver like shadows usually do. It was tall, unnaturally so, with broad shoulders and a head that seemed just a little too elongated. "Do you see that?" I whispered, nudging Danny. She looked up, her face pale. "What is that?" Chris turned to look, but by the time he did, the shadow was gone. "It's probably nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We finished packing up quickly after that, none of us wanting to admit how unsettled we were. As we started walking back to the parking lot, I glanced back at the pavilion. The shadow was there again, standing at the railing, watching us leave. I didn't say anything to the others, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as we walked. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, silhouetted against the fog and faint glow of the lake, as if waiting for something or someone. We reached the parking lot, and Chris popped the trunk of his car to toss in the cooler. Danny lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. None of us spoke for a moment, the silence stretching awkwardly between us. "You guys are acting weird," Chris finally said, forcing a laugh. It was just a shadow. Shadows don't stand still like that, Danny muttered, exhaling a puff of smoke. And they don't look at you. I opened my mouth to agree, but then I noticed something that made my heart drop. The shadow was in the parking lot. It was standing near the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, a faint outline in the mist. It was closer now, and I could see it more clearly, tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms that seemed to hang too low at its sides. My breath hitched. "Guys," I whispered, pointing. Chris and Danny turned to look, and Danny let out a sharp gasp. "Nope. Nope, nope, nope," she said, dropping her cigarette and stomping it out. "We're leaving. Now." Chris, for once, didn't argue. We scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if it was waiting to see what we'd do. Chris fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine after what felt like an eternity. As we pulled out of the lot, Danny leaned over to look out the back window. "It's gone," she said, her voice trembling. I glanced in the side mirror, my heart racing. She was right. The shadow had disappeared, but the unease didn't leave me. We drove in silence for a while, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Chris spoke. "It was just the fog, or maybe someone messing with us. Let's not freak out over nothing." Danny shot him a glare. "That wasn't nothing, Chris." I didn't say anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the shadow hadn't just vanished. And as we pulled onto the main road, my worst fears were confirmed. It was in the road. The car screeched to a halt as Chris slammed on the brakes. The shadow stood directly in front of us, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs almost brushing the ground. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the headlights illuminated it. In the harsh light, it looked even less human. Its edges blurred and shifted, like smoke caught in a wind that wasn't there. "Back up," Danny screamed. Chris threw the car into reverse, but before he could move, the shadow stepped forward. Not walking, gliding. It closed the distance between us in an instant, and suddenly, it was at the driver's side window. I'll never forget what happened next. It leaned down, its face, or what should have been its face, mere inches from the glass. There was nothing there, just darkness, an empty void that seemed to suck the light from the world. And then it spoke, though its voice wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a vibration in my chest. "Leave." The car jolted backward as Chris hit the gas, reversing down the road at a reckless speed. The shadow didn't follow. It just stood there, watching us until the fog swallowed it up. We didn't stop driving until we were back at Danny's apartment, and even then, none of us could speak for a long time. Eventually, Chris broke the silence. "We're never going back there." "Agreed?" Danny and I nodded without hesitation. I don't know what we saw that night, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the lights are low, I catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye. A tall, thin shadow that disappears the moment I turn my head. And every time, I hear that same voice, low and resonant, echoing in my mind. "Leave."